Hi, Life Group leaders. Thanks for joining us. Today, Gary is going to be leading us through a really interesting chapter. And I think we'll have some good discussion. Isaiah 37 is a good chapter. We're in session 7, God Listens. And we'll go through it and talk about it. And you ready to lead us?
I'm ready.
Let's do it.
All right. I've always told my group, one of my sayings is, I don't come to teach you anything. I come to tell you what God taught me this week. And so I was reminded of that again, that this is such an interesting chapter and what's happening and the contrast. I mean, because today's lesson ties perfectly with last week's, but it's the kind of the opposite approach there of kind of a bad decision versus a good decision today. So we get to see that contrast. So I thought we would enjoy kind of looking at that aspect. So, Richard, what thoughts do you have to maybe kick us off here from what you saw this week?
Well, the lesson title is God Listens, out of Isaiah 37. And when I was thinking about this lesson, I too thought about last week's lesson and the contrast that we have in how we listen to God. So while the title is God Listens, I kind of expanded it to be God listens to us, and the question too in that is, do we listen to Him?
Good point.
And we see the comparisons and the contrast, quite frankly, between Judah last week and Hezekiah this week. So I'm going to kind of focus on that, organize my lesson around that, because I think that has, we do know, I think, intuitively as Christians that God hears prayer, listens to us. I think what was most instructive to me is, how well do I listen?
Okay.
Or am I talking more in my prayers?
Right.
And so I'm going to talk about that, the whole concept of listening, and just to introduce that, then I'll turn it back over. But I thought about, when does God hear from us? And what does He hear from us? Mm-hmm. And then also, are we telling Him what we want Him to do, or are we asking Him what He has for us? Because, to me, there's a couple kinds. There's two kinds of people. One is they are listening and learning, and the other is they're either talking or waiting to talk. And I think sometimes we do that in our prayers. So I'm going to go kind of in that direction. And I've got some other things I'll share as we get into it. So.
Yeah, I like those questions. In fact, it's kind of where I wanted to start out today, and kind of just a little bit of an open discussion. We try to, and I like the style of always having a so what question or a statement. It's like, so what does all this mean to me? How do I apply it to my life? And so those questions you just ask about listening ties right in. I came up with a couple of so what questions I thought we'd put on the table. The first one, question number 1, is, where do we go to in times of trouble? Question number 2, who do I trust in for help, advice, comfort, direction, answers? And those questions seem to be in front of Judah, like you said last week. Who were they turning to? Well, they turned to Egypt. And Brother Tom reminded us that Egypt was symbolic with the world. They went to the world system. And the lesson today, where Hezekiah actually went to God. So we see that contrast. And I thought, if I were out in front of Walmart with my clipboard taking a poll and asking people, where do you turn to in times of trouble, and who do you go to? I'd probably get a lot of answers, and if I'd boil them down and summarize, I'd probably get two distinctive different people who more have a Christ view, a biblical worldview, versus those who have a kind of a I'm on my own worldview. And I don't want to predetermine or prejudge, but it seemed like last week we saw in chapter 31, and that was pretty scary. That first verse in chapter, woe to those who go to Egypt for help. Woe is kind of a judgment upon those who go to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in multitude of chariots and in the great strength. Like you said, they turn not to God, because it says, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or seek help from the Lord. And I'm sure you guys went through that last week in your lesson. They they were confronted with those questions. Who do they turn to? They were afraid of Assyria. They were afraid, we're too small and too weak, and we need help from a stronger ally, and they partnered with Egypt. This week, we see in chapter 37, same problem. Mm-hmm. Same fear of a big, strong army of Assyria going to overtake. But Hezekiah chose the right action and turned to the Lord. So it was interesting to see that. I thought of, and I got most of us have a Purpose-Driven Life book on the shelf, and I got mine down, and sure enough, chapter 25, and if you've got one, you might review it a little bit. But I guess Rick Warren, who wrote the book, the title of the chapter is Transformed by Trouble, and he makes a statement that God uses problems to draw us closer to Him, and said no one is immune to pain or insulated from suffering or gets to skate through life problem-free. And we know that about life, whether it's Judah, Hezekiah, our own lives. There are situations where we get to ask ourselves that question, who are we going to turn to in times of trouble, and where do we go? So I thought we would kind of zoom in on that today in chapter 37.
Gary, one thing I think is cool is we as believers know that we are to seek the Lord in the times of trials. The problem is not in believing there's a God who hears. The problem is with our ears hearing. And what's helped me through the years, in my Bible, the title says Hezekiah seeks Isaiah's help. And that's good words for me, because obviously we go to the Lord when we're in times of, He brings the trials to get us to our knees, to appeal to Him. But it's good to have, whether we call them accountability partners, encouraging partners, people that we have confidence in, mm-hmm. that we can go to and help wrestle through. Now, I think there's a danger, because if I go to Richard's not God. That's obvious. And so I have to filter Richard. Mm-hmm. But I don't have to filter God in His Word. But I need Richard. I need right. Gary. And that's kind of what the picture said. That's kind of cool to me. Hezekiah was in a bind. Right. The nation was in a bind. Right. And he prays, but there's also a prophet. Right. And that's kind of
I like that.
That's encouraging. Yeah.
A trusted advisor.
A trusted advisor. And you're not afraid of what you say, that it's going to go anywhere. Right. They accept you with all of your warts. Mm-hmm. And most of them just listen, maybe offering a comment or two. Mm-hmm. But you don't have to worry about it being on Fox News. or whatever, or getting out. And I think that should help community, right. Our life groups, our life group leaders. If you're not in community, trusted community, let me add that. If you're not in trusted community, then you're doing this lone wolf Christianity that God never intended. Right. And you're going to be on a raft in a sea. You really are. So anyway.
That's great. I'm glad you brought that out. It's that perspective we need from other people and accountability. Right. And God didn't intend, good old Hebrews 10:24-25, let us not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. Right. So that's a good point. I didn't actually pick up on that as much. I'm glad you brought that out. Some of the things here, and let's just kind of look at some of and even though our lesson talks about some of the verses, like 14 through 30 something but I had to kind of look at the bigger picture again. So in verse 1 of chapter 37, when King Hezekiah heard this, heard what? That was kind of my question. Well, you go back to chapter 26. What did he hear? Well, looking at verse 18, this is the king of Assyria saying, he's telling Judah, do not let Hezekiah mislead you when he says, the Lord will deliver us. Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land? So he was And some of our devotions we get, and I hope everyone's getting the daily devotion email. If you're not, call the church and get on there. But it talks about he was so puffed up and full of himself, the king of Assyria, thinking that all these other countries I've fought against and defeated, their gods of wood and stone were burned up. So he's mocking. He's actually mocking the one and true God, living God, our God. And he says, who of all these gods of these countries has been able to save his land? Then here's his mock. How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? He was so prideful because he's such a big, bad army. And I know how God can deliver, and we'll see that in a minute.
Wow.
And that's what, when Hezekiah heard this, he heard the king of Assyria. So he had a big problem on his hands. What does he do? And this is where I think we can handpick some good applications. First thing he did, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth. Well, what's that all about? Well, I had to do a little research. That's a sign of humility before the Lord. It was a Hebrew tradition to show an outward appearance, what was going on inside. That's that good. You're really struggling. This is the weight of this. And he took off royal garments. He's a king. He probably had some purple or whatever and put on sackcloth. So he humbled himself. And then the very next thing he did, he stewed over it for 3 or 4. No, he went to the temple. Yeah. That shows an immediate decision to go to the temple. And we jump to verse 14. What did he do? He received the letter from the messengers. That's the letter from the king of Assyria. Then, I mean, that shows an immediate response. Then he went to the temple of the Lord, spread it out before the Lord, and Hezekiah prayed. I thought, wow, we need to, because, you know, one of the things you said, a lot of times we can either turn to the world or we can turn to God, but there's kind of an in-between thing I do, and some of my friends do. Well, I'll try it on my own, and if I can't fix my problem at a last resort, I'll turn to God. Well, that's not what Hezekiah did, and that's not what we should do.
That's right.
He went immediately to the Lord, and he prayed, and there it gets back to the listening, because prayer is communication with God. It's acknowledging that there is a God, and it acknowledges that Hezekiah had a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And so, wow, those are important things. And then he acknowledged to his, O Lord, Almighty God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over heaven and earth. So he not only acknowledged God, he trusted God for the outcome of what was going to happen. So that's a lot different than last week, where they didn't go to God. They went to Egypt and formed the alliance. So
that's good.
That's that stark contrast. The interesting thing, and last week Brother Tom mentioned about what God did, is kind of that we would be studying, and it's actually chapter 38, but we'll look at that. But what was the result of Hezekiah's actions? He focused on God's power, not his problem. Last week they were focused more on their problem and ignored God's power. Just a complete opposite approach and attitude. And that's what we should do. Again, that's so what? So where do we go in times of trouble? How do we react? We should focus on God's power and not our problem. And if we wait, that opens the door that, well, why me, God? What did I do to deserve it? We start to get angry, bitter, mad at God. We start to question, and that's not the right attitude. We should go immediately to God in prayer. And so in Isaiah 37, this is that part that's pretty amazing, 37, verses 33 through 38. Here's what it says. Therefore, this is what the Lord says concerning the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city or shoot an arrow. He will not come before it with a shield. In verse 35, God said, I will defend this city and save it for my sake, and for the sake of David, my servant.
That's key.
That's key.
That's key.
That's that remnant all the way from the king and what's going to happen, King David. Then verse 36, then the angel, looks like one angel of the Lord, went and put to death 185,000 soldiers or men in the Assyrian camp. When people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. And so the king of Assyria tucked a tail and ran home, and actually was then murdered by his own sons. I mean, and the thing that got me, all those people were killed, not one Egyptian soldier, not one Egyptian chariot, God didn't need the Egyptians to defend Judah and Jerusalem. And so I thought, wow, because Hezekiah chose to made the right choice to go to God and pray and ask for help. And guess what? The problem was the same problem.
That's right.
It was the same Assyria.
That's right.
The same fear, the same as chapter 31 from last week. But same problem, two approaches, two different outcomes here.
That's good.
Then, actually, in chapter 38, you might want to touch on, that wasn't the only problem Hezekiah had. Verse 1, in those days Hezekiah became ill and was at the point of death. He's on his deathbed. And this is kind of not funny, but Isaiah came and says, I'm sorry, but you're going to die and will not recover. And what did Hezekiah do in the face of a health problem? Verse 2, he turned and prayed, and he wept bitterly. And it says God heard his prayer, and he saw his tears, and he added 15 years to his life. I thought, wow, that's inside of health problems, attacks from the enemy problem. Hezekiah knew where to go. He went to. So one final thing that I discovered here in studying this, that it's like, I wonder what his attitude was. Was it, why me, Lord? What did I do to upset you that you brought all this on me and all these problems? And it's just all this pressure and this weight of being a king and trying to lead. And well, the answer to that question is verse 17 of 38. His attitude, surely it was for my benefit that I suffered such anguish. In your love you kept me from the pit of destruction. You have put all my sins behind your back.
Well, that's a great verse.
Wow. What a great attitude, that in spite of the challenges in life, in spite of the problems we'll face,
wow,
God's plan is for our benefit. And Hezekiah saw that. It was for my benefit.
Gee, that's
what a statement. So, kind of back to our application questions that we can learn from our lesson today. Where do you go in times of trouble? Who do you turn to for help, for answers, for advice? And we know the answer is you turn to God as a Christian. It's good to have accountability partners and friends and church members to help and pray with and get perspective, but our trust has got to be in God. So,
that's good.
Any other thoughts?
A couple things. I think in chapter 37, verse 21, there's a phrase there that life group leaders, you may want to capture, and it's everything that Gary has said to us, taught us. There's a phrase that says, because you have prayed to me. Now, obviously, as he went to the Lord in his prayer, he prayed for the outcome he wanted, but he has just immediately said, you are the God, you are enthroned above the cherubim, you are God, you alone. And so the picture I get is that he's laying out his request. God, here's what I want, but you're God. And God said, well, because you prayed, I'm going to answer that. That's big. In the next chapter that you just mentioned, Gary, I have heard, verse 5, 38, chapter 38, verse 5, I have heard your prayer. I've seen your tears. Again, that's God's response. That's what you mentioned at the beginning. That's God's response to the prayer of his servant. I thought that's pretty instructive for us.
Isn't it amazing that the creator of heaven and earth hears one man's prayer?
That's right.
And he can hear our prayer.
All at the same time, too?
Yeah, it's amazing. So,
Okay.
what do you think, Richard? Any?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. You laid it out very well in your study, Gary. And I came away from this, in this whole deal of the contrast between Judah and Hezekiah, I came away with it, or away from it, trying to think, am I more like Judah or am I more like Hezekiah? Because as you look at those two situations, you could put it this way, and this is the way I just made notes. You know, on one hand, Judah panicked and Hezekiah prayed.
Right.
And Judah turned from God to men. Hezekiah turned to God right at the start. And Judah trusted in men, and Hezekiah trusted in God. And it got me thinking about, how do we approach our prayer?
Wow.
You know, you may have heard this too, that there's, some people say there's 4 elements to prayer, some say 5. And, you know, when you consider the 4, or at least 4 key elements, it's praise and adoration, confession and thanksgiving, and then petition.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the question is, in what order do we do those? And if we've got a certain amount of time we're going to spend in prayer, in what proportion do we spend each one? I would dare say that in a lot of cases, certainly in mine, many times it's more on the petition. I get a little bit backwards. And, you know, it's kind of like how children regard their parents. You know, children often spend time asking for something from us as parents when they're younger. The praise or the adoration doesn't come till later, maybe when they become parents or have experienced life and look back and say, wow, I was so fortunate. I should have been more thankful then. Well, that's just the difference in the levels of maturity. And as we grow and mature in Christ, we pray a little bit more with the adoration and the praise and the thanksgiving, and maybe not quite so much on the petition. So I kind of link this from listening to God to, do we listen to Him, and then tying that to our prayer life, because prayer is such a big part of this lesson and how Hezekiah used it in dealing with the challenges he had. So
I like
that's
Yeah, I thought the same thing. It made me think, well, I was reminded the importance of prayer, and then I instantly had to think, well, how good am I at praying, or how often do I pray, or when do I turn to God in prayer? And I need to pray more.
Yeah.
Well, and there was one other point I would make that, and it applies to both of them. There's 2 New Testament passages that you think about. You know, James says in chapter 1 that we are to be doers of the word, not just hearers. And a lot of times, you know, Judah would hear the Lord. They knew where they should turn, but Hezekiah was a doer as well. He put, you know, feet to his faith or his belief. Right. So Judah trusted in the wisdom and experience of himself and or of themselves, and he wasn't really a doer of what he knew he should do. And I think a lot of times that's where our faith is tested. Whereas Hezekiah, I thought about the verse in Matthew 7:7 where it says, you know, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find it, knock and it will be open. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what Hezekiah did, and he didn't hesitate to do it. Right. So those are just 2 comparisons.
Hezekiah.
Yeah,
Non-hesitating Hezekiah. I
preach.
like it. I like it.
Yeah, there's going to be a sermon in there somewhere.
Yeah, there's got to be a sermon in there.
Well,
hey, there's one thing that it's not part of the lesson, and I don't know how all of our life group leaders study. I tend to don't go to commentaries till after I kind of think I have my act together, which is very seldom. But there's something in verse 36.
What chapter?
That chapter 37, verse 36, that you may come across if you read commentaries, or it's something to chew on, and you may not want to bring it out. Not saying that you should even bring it out, but it's really interesting. In verse 36 of chapter 37, it says, "Then the angel of the Lord went out." Okay? Now, oftentimes in the Old Testament, theologians will call that a Christophany, or a pre-incarnate image of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not saying that's what this is, but theologians, there's theophanies, which is the images of God in the hand of God and the anger of God and all those kind of forms of God. Sometimes in the Old Testament we see that term angel of the Lord, and theologians conjecture that may be a pre-incarnate picture of Jesus. Okay, now in my Bible, my translation, angel is not capitalized.
Okay.
So it may not be.
Yeah.
But as you read that, I thought, is this an angel? But oftentimes the angel of the Lord is Christ. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But that hit me like, boy, it might lead me to a little digging, because that was kind of intriguing to me just a little bit.
Well, Gary made a point too when you were talking about that verse. You said it was an angel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't say angels,
And
plural.
It says one, and what was he able to vanquish was 185,000
Yeah.
Yeah.
men.
Yeah.
It reminded me of the death angel and the whole Passover thing.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
but go ahead.
Well, and I think the relative power, it just takes one angel of the Lord to vanquish 185,000 men. Well, so if you really believe in the power of God and you have faith in it, that kind of answers the question where we should go and where we should place our faith.
Yeah, God can do immeasurably more than we can even imagine.
That's right.
And it hit me actually this morning before we started today's video discussion. Not one chariot, not one spear,
Yeah,
and
that's
even
good.
said last week that they would fall not by a sword made of hands. This is a different God's sword, of the spiritual sword. That
Yep.
So there's a lot of ways, just like you said, we could go to show God's power to protect us, but that was kind of, I don't know what the word unleashed. It was tapped into through prayer,
Right.
where he went to him and God heard his prayer. So.
I thought
Anyway.
Richard, when he was talking about the partitions of prayer, reminded me, and it's probably what you were thinking, when we would teach on prayer, how to pray, and all those. There's different ways, as you said, but the four divisions, acts, is what you were getting at. And here's something that life group leaders, you may tell your class, that to get a little piece of paper and write down Acts, ACTS, because that's a good way to remind yourself. First is our adoration.
Yeah.
Number 2 is confession. Number 3 is thanksgiving. And then number 4 is the supplication or the petitioning. And that kind of, sometimes when I get in a funk in my prayer life, pastors probably shouldn't admit that, but we all do. Sometimes I have to go back to basics, and I have to discipline or shake myself almost and discipline myself to say, well, why don't you just adore him? Why don't you, hey, confess your shortcomings? Why don't you just give him thanks? And then, Tom, lay out the list, And so I thought that's what stirred my mind when you were doing that.
Well, it's reflective of how we're taught to pray in the Lord's Prayer.
That's right.
I mean, it gets back to the
There you
simple
go.
basics.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
That's true. Well, hopefully that helped give us some ideas. There's a lot of ways to approach. I think the contrast between last week and this week is a perfect segue into bad decision of how they choices to seek help from the world versus seeking help from God. So
That's good.
hopefully that helped you. Have a great week.
Thanks, Gary. Let me take just a moment, life group leaders, and as you hear this probably tomorrow, would you remind yourself and get word to your class that this Saturday we're going to have an exciting time for you to meet, greet, ask, and get to know our new student pastor that will be presented to the church this coming Sunday for a vote. Matt Bell and his wife Krista and their family are just wonderful, wonderful people. Great young couple, young family. And I hope you can spend some time Saturday afternoon to drop in for a moment. Fellowship Hall, I believe, beginning at 5 o'clock. Maybe have a question or two. Matt's going to be speaking to us on Sunday morning. He'll be preaching to us, and we've told him whatever God lays on his heart, you share. And then at the end of each service, without questions, then we will take a vote. That's why I really want to encourage you and your class to carve out a little bit of time to come on Saturday to ask the questions you need to ask. Exciting time for our church in a very, very important part of the faith family of Indian Springs Baptist Church. And so just remember that. Exciting times. God bless you.